The 3-story Gothic apartment building had stood sentinel over Lost Grotto's abandoned park for over 60 years, its jagged spires piercing the perpetual fog that clung to the mountain peaks like ghostly fingers. Local real estate agents avoided showing the property, whispering about the strange incidents that plagued anyone foolish enough to call it home. The ivy that choked its weathered stone walls seemed to grow despite the harsh mountain winters, twisting around broken window frames and creating grotesque patterns that resembled screaming faces in the moonlight. Detective Sarah Morrison first encountered the building on a cold September evening in 1995, responding to yet another missing person report. This time, it was the Henderson family, Ken, Jill, and their 5-year-old daughter Kim, who had vanished without a trace from the building's top-floor apartment. The sodium street lamp, casting its sickly yellow glow across the empty park below, flickered intermittently, as if struggling against some unseen force that drained its power. As Sarah approached the building's entrance, the temperature dropped noticeably. Her breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and the hair on her arms stood on end beneath her jacket. The heavy oak door, carved with intricate gargoyles and twisted vines, stood slightly ajar despite the landlord's insistence that he had locked it securely after the family's disappearance. The brass nameplate beside the door read Dr. Clifford Rue, Medical Practice, though no one in town remembered ever seeing patients enter or leave. The building's interior reeked of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Sarah's stomach churn. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under her weight, each step echoing through the hollow structure like the groaning of ancient bones. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing patches of black mold that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The ceiling above sagged in places, water stains forming patterns that looked disturbingly like ritual symbols. On the second floor, Sarah discovered Dr. Rue's former office. Medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, surgical instruments tarnished black with age and neglect. Glass cabinets that once held medications now stood empty, their shelves covered in a thick layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in months. Strange diagrams covered the walls, anatomical charts mixed with occult symbols and mathematical equations that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. In the center of the room, a pentagram had been carved deep into the wooden floor, its grooves stained dark with what Sarah hoped was merely old paint. The top-floor apartment, where the Henderson family had lived, told a more disturbing story. Furniture remained exactly as the family had left it, breakfast dishes still on the table, Kim's toys scattered across the living room floor, Jill's pregnancy vitamins spilled beside the kitchen sink. But the walls told a different tale. Scratch marks gouged deep into the plaster suggested a desperate struggle, and dark stains on the carpet led from the bedroom to a large closet door that stood open like a gaping mouth. What disturbed Sarah most was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an abandoned building, but an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to absorb sound itself. Her radio crackled with static when she tried to call for backup, the signal mysteriously blocked despite the clear night sky. Even her own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the building itself was listening, waiting for the right moment to reveal its terrible secrets. In Kim's bedroom, Sarah found a child's drawing taped to the window, a crayon sketch of the building with red figures standing in the windows. At the bottom, in a child's shaky handwriting, were the words, The man with shiny eyes took Daddy away. Sarah carefully removed the drawing as evidence, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of movement in the building's reflection on the window glass. For just a moment, she could swear she saw a tall figure with silver hair standing in the doorway behind her, smiling with eyes like polished obsidian. When she spun around, the doorway was empty, but the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and somewhere in the building's depths, she could hear the faint sound of chanting, low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the cursed structure. Jill Henderson's world began to unravel the night she discovered the hidden passage behind her bedroom closet. What started as a search for extra blankets during a particularly cold October evening in 1995 became a journey into a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. The closet, like everything else in the top-floor apartment, seemed ordinary enough. A simple wooden structure built into the wall, filled with her family's winter clothes and forgotten belongings. But that night, as Jill pushed aside Ken's old coats and her maternity dresses, her fingers found something unexpected. The back wall of the closet wasn't solid wood as it appeared, but a cleverly concealed panel that gave way under pressure. Cool air rushed through the gap, carrying with it the scent of incense and something far more sinister, the metallic tang of old stains and the cloying sweetness of decay. The passage beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. Rough wooden planks formed makeshift walls, and the floor consisted of warped boards that creaked with every step. Jill's flashlight beam revealed scratch marks along the walls, as if countless hands had clawed at the wood in desperation. Strange symbols were carved into the timber, not the Christian crosses and fish that adorned their own apartment, but twisted sigils that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. As Jill crept through the passage, she could hear sounds from the other side. Muffled voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, the scrape of furniture being moved, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The passage curved slightly to the left, following the building's architecture, before opening into Dr. Rue's apartment through what appeared to be an identical hidden panel in his bedroom closet. What Jill saw when she emerged would haunt her dreams for the remaining weeks of her life. Dr. Rue's apartment was a mirror image of her own, but transformed into something from a nightmare. The walls were painted black and covered with occult symbols drawn in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Candles flickered from every surface, their wax pooling on antique furniture and expensive Persian rugs. The air was thick with incense smoke that made Jill's eyes water and her throat burn. But it was the basement that revealed the true horror of Dr. Rue's activities. A set of stairs, hidden behind a bookshelf filled with ancient tomes, led down to a chamber that predated the building above. Stone walls wept with moisture, and the floor was carved with an elaborate ritual circle that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Around the circle's perimeter stood 13 chairs, each one occupied by a figure in a black hooded robe. In the center of the circle sat a bassinet, ornate, silver, and undeniably expensive. The soft cry of an infant echoed through the chamber, and Jill's maternal instincts screamed that this was her child, the baby she had been told was stillborn just days earlier. Dr. Rue stood beside the bassinet, no longer the charming neighbor who had offered medical assistance, but revealed as something far more sinister. His silver hair gleamed in the candlelight, and his obsidian eyes reflected the flames like polished stones. The hooded figures chanted in unison, their voices creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. The words were in Latin, ancient and powerful, calling upon entities that existed long before Christianity brought its light to the mountain peaks of Lost Grotto. As the chanting intensified, the baby's cries grew stronger, more desperate, as if the infant somehow understood the terrible fate that awaited. Jill tried to scream, to rush forward and snatch her child from the circle, but her voice caught in her throat and her legs refused to move. Some force held her paralyzed in the shadows, forced to witness as Dr. Rue lifted a ceremonial dagger, its blade carved with the same symbols that covered the walls, and began the final phase of whatever ritual he had been planning since the day her family moved into the apartment above. It was only when one of the hooded figures turned toward her hiding spot that the spell broke. The face beneath the hood was Ken's, her husband's, his features twisted with an expression of ecstatic madness she had never seen before. His eyes, once warm brown, now reflected the same obsidian darkness as Dr. Rue's. The sight of her husband's transformation snapped Jill out of her paralysis, and she stumbled backward through the passage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She barely made it back to her own apartment before the sounds of pursuit echoed through the hidden tunnel. Footsteps, many of them, scrambling through the narrow space with inhuman speed. Jill slammed the closet panel shut and dragged her heavy dresser against the closet door, but she knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from within the walls themselves, and she realized with growing horror that the building itself was part of the ritual. Every room, every apartment, every hidden space designed to channel and amplify the dark energies that Dr. Rue and his followers sought to harness. The abandoned copper mines of Lost Grotto had been sealed for over 30 years when young Tommy Chen first heard the stories about children disappearing into their depths. Local legends spoke of demonic entities that dwelt in the tunnels, feeding on the souls of the innocent and growing stronger with each victim. But it wasn't until Kim Henderson shared her family's terrifying story that Tommy understood the mines were connected to something far more sinister than simple folklore. The mine entrance gaped like a wound in the mountainside, its steel support beams rusted and twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled skeletal remains. Warning signs posted by the county decades earlier had faded to illegibility, their messages about dangerous gases and unstable tunnels lost to time and weather. But new symbols had been carved into the rock face around the entrance, the same occult sigils that Kim described seeing in Dr. Rue's apartment, suggesting that the doctor's activities extended far beyond the Gothic building where her family had lived. Tommy's investigation began 3 months after Kim's family vanished, when hiking trails around Lost Grotto started claiming victims with alarming frequency. Experienced outdoorsmen would set out on well-marked paths and simply disappear, leaving behind only their equipment and strange reports from other hikers about hearing chanting echoing from the sealed mine shafts. The local sheriff's department blamed the disappearances on bear attacks or simple accidents, but Tommy knew better. He had heard Kim's story, seen the terror in her eyes as she described the ritual chamber beneath the apartment building. Armed with climbing gear and a high-powered flashlight, Tommy descended into the main shaft on a moonless October night. The temperature dropped dramatically as he moved deeper into the mountain, his breath forming clouds in air that grew thicker and more oppressive with each step. The modern mining equipment had long since been removed, but older artifacts remained: rusted pickaxes, broken lanterns, and scattered bones that might have belonged to animals but seemed suspiciously small and delicate. The tunnel branched repeatedly as Tommy descended, creating a maze of passages that seemed designed to confuse and disorient intruders. Strange acoustics made sounds echo in impossible ways, creating the illusion that voices called from multiple directions at once. More than once, Tommy was certain he heard Kim's voice calling for help, pleading for someone to save her from the darkness. But when he followed the sounds, they led only to dead ends or chambers that reeked of decay and something far worse. 20 feet below the main level, Tommy discovered the first ritual chamber. Unlike the basement beneath Dr. Rue's apartment, this space had been carved directly from the living rock by hands that understood both mining techniques and occult geometry. The walls curved in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, creating optical illusions that made the chamber seem much larger than its actual dimensions. Stalactites had been shaped into the semblance of reaching hands, their limestone fingers dripping with moisture that pooled in carefully carved channels leading to a central altar. The altar itself was a masterpiece of horrific craftsmanship. Carved from a single block of black granite, its surface was stained with decades of ritual use. Symbols covered every inch of its face, not just the Latin-derived sigils Tommy recognized from occult research, but older markings that seemed to predate human language entirely. Around the altar space, 13 smaller stones had been arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved with a different phase of the moon and stained with what could only be dried blood. But it was the chamber's acoustics that revealed its true purpose. Every sound made in the space was amplified and distorted, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate through the mountain itself. When Tommy spoke aloud, testing the echo, his voice returned to him as a chorus of whispers in languages he didn't recognize. The effect was so disturbing that he quickly fell silent, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if the mountain itself was trying to communicate. Deeper in the mine complex, Tommy found evidence of recent activity: fresh footprints in the dust, recently burned candles, and most disturbing of all, children's belongings scattered throughout the tunnels. A small pink backpack that might have belonged to Kim Henderson lay abandoned in one chamber, its contents spilled across the stone floor. Among the scattered items, Tommy found a child's diary with entries describing the same nightmares that had plagued Kim's mother: dreams of being surrounded by shadowy figures and awakening to find strange marks on her arms and legs. The deepest chamber Tommy discovered defied rational explanation. The walls here weren't carved stone, but something that resembled living tissue, pulsing with a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with his own. The air was thick with a sulfurous stench that burned his throat and made his eyes water. In the center of this organic chamber stood a figure that might once have been Dr. Rue, that had been transformed into something that belonged more in hell than on earth. The